Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video. All right, so listing agreement. Shouldn't take us long to get through the listing agreement, but again, I want to go back, look at it, go through it, make sure that you guys understand it, because as much as it is easier to fill out than the purchase agreement, there are still some things that you need to understand as a broker, or as an agent, and make sure that you are explaining the agreement properly to your potential seller. Okay. All right. So if there are no questions, then I will share my screen with you guys. All right. So you should be looking at the disclosure regarding agency relationships. Okay. All right. So again, like always, when we start the RPA and we start the listing contract, one of the first things we talk about is this disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. And I always like to talk about it, discuss it, because I think still to this day, for agents, there is some maybe some not quite correct beliefs about what this form does or what it's for, right? So as it reads, disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships, it is just that. It is a disclosure, okay? There is, by signing this form, there is nothing that forces the buyer or seller to work with you, nothing that forces you to work with the buyer and seller. All it is proof that you have explained to that potential client how they can be represented by an agent. That's it, right? So the Department of Real Estate requires that you disclose to anybody, any potential client, how they could be represented by an agent. And that's discussed here in this disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. First, as a seller's agent, right? We're listing your property, right? In this case, I'm on a listing appointment, but as a seller's agent, I can represent you in the sale of your house. I can be a buyer's agent. You can be represented by an agent as a buyer. And then there is an agent representing both buyer and seller, and that's dual agency. And in that regard, dual agency, I am required to get your permission to act in that capacity. Right? You have to approve it. And that approval, that consent around dual agency happens on a separate form. Okay? So when you are explaining this and you have a buyer or seller sign this form and you sign it with them, all you've done is explain to them how they can be represented, and they're acknowledging that explanation. It is not a commitment to work with you. Okay, so when we have conversations with those potential clients, we have to make sure they understand that even if after that initial consultation, I'm working with a buyer and I sit down with them and we start talking about what it is they want to do, part of that consultation is this. The same thing with the seller is this should be the very first thing that I have them sign, because I am now going to discuss with them the process of them selling their home. So when I walk in a listing presentation, I should leave with this disclosure regarding agency relationships, even if a seller chooses not to sign a listing agreement with me. That's the right thing to do. Because again, it is not a commitment for us to work together. They are not bound to me in any way by signing it, but I should have it. Because even without, let's just say that I shared some information with the seller, and for whatever reason, because people are nuts, they decided to report me to the Department of Real Estate based on the conversation we have. And I have an investigator contact me from the Department of Real Estate, and they ask me for my disclosure regarding agency relationships, and I don't have one because they didn't sign a listing agreement. I could be in trouble. I know that's a far-fetched idea that you're going to have that kind of trouble, but by the letter of the law, I am to have one of these for every client I speak to about real estate, whether or not they have signed a contract, right? Whether that be a representation agreement for a buyer or a listing agreement for a seller or even a purchase agreement for a buyer, right? I should have one of these ahead of time. So one of the great things about going on a listing appointment with this disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships is you can use it as a tool. Not only is it something that's required, but you can use it as a tool, because we know, those of us that go on listing presentations, that when we're trying to go through the process of the listing presentation, and part of that process is I need to go take a look at the house and take notes, right? Look at the property through the eyes of the buyer. I need to do all that stuff. It's difficult sometimes when the seller's following you through the house, giving you information room by room and telling you about what's great about the property and, you know, what I did and what I changed. So one of the things you could do, and like I said, use this as a tool, is you could say, hey, listen, by the way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start taking notes on the property as if I were a buyer, the notes that I'm going to put in the MLS when we go to sell the property. If I could have you go through this disclosure regarding agency relationships, what this is this is a disclosure I have to have you sign that shows that I explained to you how you could be represented by an agent. And that's either as a buyer's agent, a seller's agent, or as a dual agent, where I represent both buyer and seller, and you have to give us permission in order to do that. And dual agency doesn't just include me representing the buyer and seller, it's the entire brokerage. So any of the agents that work in my office, if they have a buyer that wants to buy your property, we would be acting in dual agency. You'd have to give us permission to do that. But that's what this form is. So you could go ahead and read through it. And if I could get you to sign that while I go and take notes, that would be great. Now you got them busy and you could do your notes. And if they do sign it without giving you too much pushback, it's a pretty good indication on how the rest of the listing presentation is going to go. Okay. So you could always do that. That's not something that you have to do. It's just an option when we get, run into those sellers that want to be connected at the hip as we go to do our walkthrough. So that's the agency disclosure. Now, we're not going to confirm agency, even though it does have an example of what confirmation of agency will look like. Do you see that? It has an example of it. Don't complete that, because what we don't want to do is we don't want to confirm agency on that form. And I have seen agents that like to circle, like, hey, we're on a listing appointment, so you're my seller. I'm working as a seller's agent, and they put a big circle around seller's agent. That could be misconstrued as a confirmation of agency. So leave it alone as it is. Just have it signed and dated, and that's it. And hold on to it. Okay, that's all you got to do. Questions about the disclosure regarding agency relationships before we move on? Anybody? No? All right. I mean, we've gone over it quite a bit, so I'm sure that most of you, the majority of you, are familiar with it and understand how it works. But again, it is not just a form that exists because we have to. I mean, it is important, even though that it's, just this disclosure that doesn't bind anybody to us. I mean, we've had, and I've shared this with you guys in the past, we had a listing agent who didn't get paid a commission because he had his seller sign this form after the listing agreement and after a purchase agreement, right? They weren't dated prior to, they were dated after those two forms. The seller complained, and the seller did not have to pay a commission because they didn't get this disclosure in a timely manner. So that disclosure regarding agency relationships has to be dated the same as your purchase or listing agreement, or prior to, not after, okay? Fair housing, this is, again, we're not going to read through this whole thing, but all this is don't discriminate, right? It gives the rules about, hey, we have to make sure that we're fair in our practices on who we show and give opportunities to purchase the home, okay? We're going to skip through that. This, the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure, and consent. This is the form I talked about when I was explaining the disclosure regarding agency relationships. This is where we get the authority to work as a dual agent. So you need to have this signed. Plus, it's two pieces. It's a disclosure about the representation of a brokerage with more than one buyer or seller, not just you as an individual agent, but the brokerage as a whole. Because remember, when we talk about dual agency, it is the entire brokerage, right? Everybody whose license is hung in this brokerage. So everybody that works for this office or the office that you work at, everybody is working for one entity, right? So if I have if my office has a listing, and then one of the agents in my office brings a buyer, that is still dual agency. So the idea is that we want to make sure that the sellers understand that it's in their best interest to approve the dual agency possibility in their listing, because if we don't, then what we're doing is we're cutting out not only me representing the buyer, but we're cutting out all the other agents in the office that they cannot bring their buyers to. And we know that that's generally the most likely way that we're going to find the buyers for your home. And it's the fastest way is by being able to market it to the agents in our own office and get those people out there to see it. There's buyers out there. So we don't want to, remove those potential buyers from the market just because of the dual agency situation. Now, what I will tell you guys is the lights just went off while I'm doing this. So hopefully, luckily I'm not on camera while the lights are off, but you guys can see the screen. What happens with this form is that we have to also explain to them that even if they don't approve for us to act as a dual agent in this brokerage may have many listings and many buyers that are all similar, right? So if I'm working with a buyer, not only do I have a buyer that's maybe looking for a home in a specific city that's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath that's $600,000, but in our brokerage, we have multiple other buyers that are also looking for those homes. And we may be competing for the same homes as buyer. And the same thing for a seller is that you have to understand how the market works is that I may have your listing for your home, which is a 4-bedroom, 2-bath for $800,000, but there is also 3 or 4 other agents that have listings that are almost identical to yours. Okay? So you kind of have to understand that just because maybe the brokerage has a listing that is very similar to yours may sell first, theirs may sell first. It has nothing to do with you specific. It is just the way the market works, okay? And then it does talk about dual agency right here, right? The one thing that I always like to bring up on this one too is this, because I always try to reinforce this. Offers not necessarily confidential, okay? Buyers advise that seller or listing agent may disclose the existence, terms, or conditions of buyer's offer unless all parties and their agent have signed a written confidentiality agreement. Whether any such information is actually disclosed depends on many factors, such as current market conditions, the prevailing practice in the real estate community, the listing agent's marketing strategy, and the instructions of the seller. Buyer and seller understand that broker may represent more than one buyer, more than one seller, and even both buyer and seller on the same transaction and consent to such relationships. So there's the consent that we were talking about for dual agency. But this non-confidential section is the thing that's most important, right? Because the response has always been from listing agents is, I cannot share it with you. It's like it's not allowed. Well, that may be true, but it's not that the real estate community, like the Department of Real Estate, CAR, doesn't stop you from sharing that information. That's a choice that you can make with you and your client, maybe, right? Where the seller says, I don't want you to share. But the problem is that normally the client isn't the one that's making that decision. It becomes the agent making that decision. And when it's the agent who's choosing to not share the information of the potential offers that exist, it's not necessarily in the best interest of the seller, right? So if I have a conversation with my seller that says, hey, listen, now that we're deciding to market our property and we're getting offers in, I can share the information of all of these offers with the potential offers that are coming. And what that does is it either gets the people who are potential offers to increase their offer or to better their offer to be more competitive with the existing offers we have, or it discourages people from submitting offers that aren't going to be competitive. And then what that does is it gives us a choice, right? If we don't have to go through non-competitive offers and have all these offers presented to you because legally I have to present them to you, by sharing the details of the offers that we already have in hand, we can limit and we can filter it into just the good offers that make sense for us, right? We could potentially we can stop people from submitting those non-competitive offers. Now, if the seller says to me, no, I'd prefer you don't, I just want to see everything come in and we'll go from there, then great. Now I can say, okay, great. Now we can have in writing, I can get an instruction from my seller. Even in an email, I can send an email that says, Mr. Seller, just respond to this email, please, that you and I discussed. You do not want me to share the information of other offers, of the offers that we have in hand with other potential clients, right? Or with other potential buyers. And that's fine. That's okay. You don't have to have that full-on confidentiality agreement, okay? But here's the truth. The truth is if I'm a listing agent and I'm trying to do everything possible for my seller for them to get top dollar, to go into transaction with the best possible buyer, then there is no negative reason. There's no reason against me sharing the other offers. There's no reason behind it. So if somebody calls me and I'm a listing agent and they say, what's the best offer you have? My business model is I'm going to share that information. And because offers aren't confidential, even if it's my own offer that's the best, I'm going to share it. Because just like my offer wasn't confidential and I shared that information with the potential buyer's agent, I can go now back to my buyer and say, hey, the offer that you submitted, we just got another one. Here it is. And it's better than yours. What do you want to do? Right? I can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay. So you have to start thinking about what's the best interest for my seller. And really for you guys, and I know the market has changed. I know that 9 months ago or 10 months ago when we had this class previously, or we've discussed listings previously, I know that there was way more offers coming in. So it was more important to be able to filter out those offers, because we didn't want to have to present every offer, and we were getting 20 and 30 offers, and more than half of those 20 or 30 weren't even going to have a shot, but we still had to present them. So it was time consuming. But we're still kind of in the same position, only that if I'm going to provide good service to my seller, even if I get multiple offers that are 5, and of those 5, 3 are non-competitive because 2 are ultimately head and shoulder above the rest of them as far as what my sellers should be considering, why do I want to make them sit through the idea of having to present an offer that isn't going to be competitive, if I could have eliminated those offers by telling that buyer's agent, hey, listen, here's the offers that we have, the 2 that we're considering. If you guys can match or better, please submit your offer. If you're not going to get to those levels, then I would suggest you don't. You feel free to submit if you want to, but I would suggest you don't if you can't meet those demands, like if you can't meet those criteria. And they'll probably won't submit at that point. That's just my opinion. But I think sharing what we do have gives us an opportunity to create more competitive offers or to eliminate non-competitive ones to begin with. Okay, so in the chat we have, is it illegal for agents to bluff about offers on the table? It's hard to say that anything is illegal. There's no law that says you can't, you can't exaggerate maybe the amount of offers or having offers. Is it ethical? That's a question too, but illegal? No. And yeah, all listing agents, and I bet there's some listing agents that are live on the class right now, and maybe you're going to watch this video later, that have said, yeah, sure, we have other offers right now, right? Just to get people excited about submitting it. So, it's not cool, but it is not illegal. The other question in the chat says, if a buyer's agent sends us an offer with the confidentiality disclosure, does the seller have to sign it to make it valid? There is no confidentiality disclosure. Technically, it would be just something that was written up. Like, there's not a CAR form for it. But yeah, for your transaction to be confidential, everybody would have to sign, not just the one party. Okay. Questions about the PRBS before we move on? Any other questions? No? All right. Wire fraud, again, just tell your clients, do not wire anything to anybody without checking with me first. That's it. This is just saying wire fraud is like a huge problem right now, which we know it is, and it still is. And it's probably, because the market's starting to get a little bit more difficult, right? A lot more work. It's probably going to kick up again, right? So just tell your clients, don't wire anything to escrow without me verifying it's the correct wiring instructions first, okay? All right, residential listing agreement. So first off, date prepared up in the left-hand corner there. Date prepared. What date are we preparing it? That doesn't mean that it's going to be signed that day. It doesn't mean that it's going to go active that day. It's just the date that I prepared it. So, for example, I have a listing appointment on Saturday, let's say. I can put a date of today. If I put the whole listing package together today, like maybe I send a pre-listing package to my potential sellers. So in a pre-listing package, I would send a listing agreement. So if I want to send it out early, then that listing agreement is going to get prepared early. Even though my appointment is Saturday the 12th, today we are on, right, November the 9th, or 10th, sorry, I'm a day late. We're November 10th. So I write the listing contract today. My start date might be 11/12, but the date it is prepared is today, okay? So date prepared, when I fill all this stuff out. Exclusive right to sell. All of the seller's names need to go in there. Now, if it is a trust, the name of the trust is the seller. Okay, always, even if it is the original trustees, right? And when I say original trustees, I mean the original owners that first set up the trust, created the trust, put the property in the trust, right? So Kyle Estrada is the human being. I have the Estrada Family Trust. The seller of the property is the Estrada Family Trust. Even though I'm the one who originated it, I bought it, I will sign my name for the trust, but the seller is the trust. Okay, always. Now, I were to not be here anymore and my successor trustee had taken over, then that person, the seller would still be the Estrada Family Trust, but that person, whoever the successor trustee was, would be signing their name as the person that takes care of the trust, right? They would be the successor trustee. So whatever the seller's name is, if it's a corporation, same thing, right? That's what goes in there. Try to make sure it's the legal names of the sellers. I mean, it's not as important as it is with a purchase agreement, because the purchase agreement has, the lenders are involved and it has to match to get qualifications and things like that. With this one, you're going to go through some other processes that, doing grant deeds and things to transfer the property with the correct names. I would try to, as best as possible, have the correct legal name on here, just so if there was any dispute on the validity of the listing agreement, it has the actual names on there, but as close as possible to their true legal names. Okay. So that's the seller's names there. You can, if there's 10 sellers, guess what's going to happen? You're going to have to do that. There are additional signature addendums for them to sign on, but all the names have to go in. They may not all fit, but all the names have to go in. So exclusive right to sell is the seller. Hereby employs and grants. That's Century 21 All-Stars, the broker. Not you, the broker. The listing period, a begin date and an end date. This form must have a begin date and an end date to be valid. If there is no begin date or if there is no end date, the listing is unenforceable. Okay? So as you're going through these steps, make sure that your listing agreement has a beginning date and an ending date. Now, the beginning date, again, because we don't know exactly, we go on a listing appointment. If I schedule a listing appointment for tomorrow, I'm going to assume that tomorrow would be the beginning date of it. But let's say that I create my contract and have my whole package ready to go today. I put tomorrow as the begin date, and then my appointment gets rescheduled, right? Maybe the begin date is going to be different. I don't necessarily need to change it, because as far as the MLS is concerned, there is a begin date, yes. But when they look at it, they look at the active date of a listing is either the beginning date or the date it was signed, whichever is the latest. Okay, so let's say, for example, I put a beginning date of 11/12, right? We've already talked about that date for the appointment, 11/12, but I ultimately don't meet with the client until Monday, and they sign the agreement on Monday. The actual active start date of that listing now becomes Monday the 14th of December, okay, or of November. December, geez. I'm having a rough day with dates and months right now. So, but you must have a begin date and end date again, or it is unenforceable. Okay. That's the listing period. The exclusive and irrevocable right to sell or exchange the real property described as. Now, it's important to understand that it says the exclusive and irrevocable right to sell or exchange the real property. They are signing an agreement that says, I am saying you are the exclusive agent for me. Now, let me backtrack a little bit. That's specific to this form. There are 3 different listing agreements. There is the exclusive authorization and right to sell, which is the one you should always be using. There is the agency listing agreement, and the difference between the agency listing agreement and this exclusive authorization to sell listing agreement is that it has one different clause in it. And that different clause is if the seller procures their own buyer, they can sell to that buyer at any price that they want, and they don't have to pay you a commission if they procure their own buyer. That's the difference. The third one is the open listing, which is the most ridiculous listing agreement that exists. And that open listing agreement is basically, yeah, you signed a listing with me, but I pay commission to whoever brings me the buyer, and that's it. You don't represent me as the seller when another agent brings the buyer. So those are the three. Make sure you're always using the exclusive authorization and right to sell. Okay. So, but this listing agreement, what it says, this listing agreement says the exclusive and irrevocable right to sell or exchange, meaning I'd have to do something really considerably wrong in order for them to be able to say, no, you're. This is a legal document. It's a contract. Have to think about you have to think about when we're having the discussions with the sellers that this is, I know we call it the listing agreement. It is a listing contract. It is a legally binding contract, and it is a bilateral contract, which means anything that happens in this contract has to be agreed upon by both parties. So when a seller does sign this, when we sign it, we are in a pact with these people. We're a partnership now. They work with us. Like, in order for them to void the contract, that, like, they talk about it like, oh, we want you to cancel and we want to fire you. Well, this is voiding a contract. It's not just canceling, right? I know that those are the terms that we use, but again, remember, it's legally binding. So if I refuse to give the cancellation to the seller, I don't have to, right? So for those of you that understand, for us as managers and brokers, when we get the phone calls from sellers who decide they don't want to work with the agents any longer, they better have a very compelling reason as to why they don't want to work with those agents any longer, because we're not always going to be agreeable to canceling a listing. It has to be a reason why we did something wrong. We dropped the ball. If they're just looking to change to another broker because somebody got in their ear and told them they could do it for less or get them more, we're probably not going to approve that cancellation. So that's what they have to understand, is that it's irrevocable. It means that it is. So we got a question in the chat here. Which one is the one that says a seller can bring his own buyer? It's the agency listing agreement. So where you look at residential listing agreement at the top, instead of exclusive authorization sale, I think it says agency authorization. So don't use that one. And then the open is anybody. Going back to the listing period, how much time should we aim for the listing? Look, guys, if you're doing anything less than 6 months right now, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. And as this market continues to trend into the normal, neutral, whatever you want to call it, market, because it is not a buyer's market yet. It is still a seller's market. So let's not get this confused. At the point of this recording, which is November the 10th, 2022, this is still a seller's market based on inventory periods or amounts of inventory, months of inventory, sales prices, the whole thing. This is still a seller's market, very much a seller's market. We are months, we're months and months of inventory away from a buyer's market. But because we're into a normal, neutral market, you're going to start seeing days on markets that are going to be in the 60s and the 90 days. So if you have a 90-day listing, there's a chance that even in this normal market, you may get to the end of your listing agreement before your activity is really moving. So at the very least, you should be looking at 6 months. And as we get deeper into this, before the market shifts again, you're probably going to be closer to year-long contracts, but I would not be doing anything less than 6 months. Okay. In the chat, somebody just said, but what if the seller would only give us a 3 or 4 month, still take it, right? Well, it depends. Is it a sellable listing? All of the stuff, like whenever we get these, like, should I take a reduced commission? Should I list it for less time? Should I list it for more money? Like all of those questions, like, when do I say yes? The blanket answer to all of those is a business decision for you. But it all falls back to, is this a really sellable listing? So if a seller says to me, look, you're only getting 3 months, or you're only getting 60 days, or you're only getting, whatever it is, If they're priced competitively, right, like aggressively priced, absolutely, I'll take the 3 months. If they're overpriced, paying little commission, and want a short-term listing, why am I going to commit the energy to an unsellable listing? Right now, if you look at it and say, for me, this is a good business decision, whether it's I haven't taken a listing and maybe I can take this listing and I can leverage it into other, buyers and sellers, and I can work off of it. Again, that becomes a business decision for you. But the main thing that you want to look at with those listings where people are doing things where they're either, where you're taking a listing that's overpriced, or you're taking a listing that's a short term, or you're taking a listing with a very low commission, look at the other sides of it and say, hey, can I make this a sellable listing with these terms? If the answer is yes, then you should move forward. Absolutely. If all you can do on somebody that's reasonable on price in a good neighborhood is they'll only give you 3 months, yeah, take it. Absolutely. I'm not saying nope, sorry, but if they want to give you, because I don't know how many times I've had in the past year or so people that say, oh, they only want to give me a 30-day listing. Maybe a year ago, if you were priced super competitively, a 30-day listing wouldn't be a problem because you would be in escrow in the first 3 or 4 days and stuff like that. But you want to make sure that you have enough time to market, enough time to get through transaction and close before that listing expires. Okay. So keep that in mind. All right. So then the next section is where the property is, the address. Make sure the address is correct. Now, if it's a manufactured home, you're going to check this box. A manufactured home or mobile home, you can call it either or, that are in a park or not in a park, but you're going to check this box. And what it's going to do is it's going to attach the mobile home listing addendum. And so it's going to have the information. It's going to have the information about the mobile home and some other things that are a little different than the normal, just a plain residential listing agreement. So you have to incorporate that. Okay. Or if this is part of a probate, you got to check this box and it'll include the probate listing addendum. One thing also I want to mention on this is that this residential listing agreement is good for up to 4 units. So I know that when we talk about the purchase of 2 to 4 units, I always instruct you that it's your best interest to use the residential income purchase agreement. And I stand by that. But in a listing situation where I'm listing 4 units or less, I'm always going to use this residential one. We only need to move to that commercial residential income listing agreement when we're talking about 5 units plus. Okay. So this is going to be your go to 1 to 4 units. In the chat, I've got what happens if a listing agreement expires while you're in escrow? Can the agreement be extended? So once the listing agreement expires, if you're past the expiration date, you'd have to do a new listing. Prior to the listing expiring, you could do a modification of listing terms, right, to change the expiration date. If you're in escrow and the listing expires, as long as that escrow continues and closes, you're still the listing agent. You're still the seller's agent. All the terms that were agreed to in the listing and in the purchase agreement, they stand. The only difference is that while I'm in escrow, if that listing expires, technically another agent could come in and list the property out from underneath me. And if that escrow falls out, then I'm out and they're with another listing agent. But yes, the listings can always be extended. They can always be modified. Prices, commissions, the expiration date, all that stuff can be modified prior to the expiration date. Once we pass the expiration date, you would have to do a whole new listing agreement. You can't just do an extension. Can the seller back out of the sale at that case? No. The seller can only get out of once they're in a transaction with the buyer, they can only cancel based on the terms of that transaction, not because their listing expired. So no, they can't back out of the sale. Okay. All right. Listing price and terms. The listing price shall be, this is in words, this is in numbers, right? So A right here, this part is numbers. This part right here this part is words, and this is numbers. That's the way they do it now. I know that when we put in the information on zip forms, it fills in everything for us, right? We don't have to type, 700,000 out in words. We don't have to do that. We write 700,000 in the dollar section and it prints the words for us. It's okay. This is still that section 2A is still the exact same way it was for me 20 years ago when I wrote my first, when I first looked at a contract. It's probably the same way it was 25 years ago or 30 years ago. And before that, I'm not sure. But it's similar to, and here we go, dating myself. And for those of you that are younger, it's the same way as writing a check, right? For those of you that don't write checks anymore, when you write a check, you put a number in and you write out the words. And the reason for that is to make sure there's not a discrepancy, that we have the right amount, that we didn't make a mistake. So it probably doesn't need to be there anymore, but it still is. That's the form. So words, numbers, that's how it works. Now, if you're handwriting one of these, you're not using zip forms, you're out in the field, you got to do it, kind of like old school. You got to write it, then make sure that's words and numbers. For listing terms, this is in text in the chat. For listing terms, if you and the seller agree, if you get more than list price, I'll give you 1% more commission. Do you write it there? No, I wouldn't put it there. I would put it here. And we'll get to compensation in a minute. But listing terms, it could be anything that affects the listing agreement itself, not necessarily what could be something that we could put in there? Like this is subject to title transfer, right? Or, um, contingent sales are addressed later. So it could be anything that's going to affect like the actual listing agreement itself, not just the compensation. Compensation to broker. The amount or rate of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between seller and broker. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker. So, hold on. There's a chat I'll get to in just a minute, Jesus. Okay. Seller agrees to pay broker as compensation for services, irrespective of agency relationships, either blank percent of the listing price, or if a purchase agreement is entered into of the purchase price, or a flat rate, and as follows, right? So let's say that, like Joseph's earlier question was, if I wanted to give him a bonus, 1% bonus for over asking price, right? You could put that in here. So when we look at the commissions, it says irrespective of agency relationships. Okay. That just means it doesn't matter who represents who. I'm agreeing for you as listing agent. I'm paying you 6%, 5%, 4%, whatever that is. This is the total compensation. So when I go in and I negotiate my listing agreement with the seller and I get them to say, okay, we're going to pay 6% commission because I'm going to share commission with an outside broker, this is 6%. Okay. It's not just the listing side. This is the entire compensation, because in a listing agreement, the seller is paying us, Century 21 All Stars, or the brokerage you work for, 100% of the commission. As listing broker, we're sharing a part of that with the cooperating broker. Okay. Jesus, you wrote in there, can you talk a little bit about double escrows? I mean, technically, they're not really legal. I know people do them, and they do when they say I'm wholesaling, right? But double escrow would be I buy it and then I go and sell it to somebody else, and they open another escrow, a second escrow that goes kind of runs concurrent. It closes afterwards. That's not the right way to do it. If I was going to do that, for example, I would do an assignment, probably would be the best way to do it, right? I would buy it. I didn't want to continue. I sold it to another investor. I would do an assignment and disclose to the seller that I was making the money, because even if I do a double escrow, I have to disclose to the seller that I'm doing it and I'm making the money on it, right? Like I can't buy a home from you, Jesus, and then sell it to Sylvia while I'm in escrow with you. So I buy it from you at 500 and then I turn around and I sell it to Sylvia. So I have two escrows going at the same time. I have to disclose to you that I sold it to Sylvia for $600,000. Right. So what seller is going to be okay with the idea that, well, wait a minute, why am I selling it for 5 if somebody else is willing to sell it for 6? And so what happens is when you get into positions like that, where you're reselling a property before you've closed the escrow, and even sometimes after the fact that you're going to resell it after you've closed, if you're buying it at a bargain and you're going to resell it for a profit and you're not disclosing it to the sellers, legally that could lead to issues for you because you're not being honest with the seller. So yeah, that's double escrows are they're troublesome to say the least, if not illegal. Let's see, Darwin, if the seller doesn't agree with the sales price in order to change it, the seller just have to initial and change the price right there. Oh, okay. So you're on the listing presentation. So let's say that, yes, good. That's a good question, Darwin. When I prepare my listing presentation and my listing agreement, I'm going to put my price in, right? When we were talking about where the price goes, I'm going to put it in. So if I think their house is worth $750,000 and that's what I want to list it at, I'm writing $750,000 there. But when I get to the listing appointment and we start to review everything and the seller goes, no, I'd rather sell for 775. If I'm okay with that change in price, then yes, all we're going to do is we're going to cross a line through here. We're going to handwrite 775 and we're going to have the seller initial next to the change in the price and we're good. Now, if we've already agreed on a price of 750, we've moved on, we're a few days in or a week into the escrow and they want to change the price, that's another form you have to use. You can't just make that change. Okay. But yes, at the moment, you can do that. What about the written out list price? Cross that one out too. No, I'm okay with it just being the numbers as long as they initial it, but I see what you're saying. You don't need to go through the whole rewriting the whole thing. On that adjustment there, just cross it out by the numbers. You'll be okay. You'll be safe. But good question. I like that, Joseph. You're paying attention.
Thanks.
Paying attention. All right. So the compensation, 6%, 5%, 4%, whatever you charge, that's your business. Okay. That's what the seller's going to pay you. Now, there are more than one way to get paid from this listing agreement. And I usually ask you guys how many is there and see who knows. There's 4. That's it. There's 4 ways you as an agent can get paid from this listing agreement. The first one is really straightforward. You sell the property. If during the listing period or any extension, broker, cooperating broker, seller, or any other person procures a ready, willing, and able buyer who's offered to purchase the property on any price and terms. Now, any price and terms doesn't have to be what we listed it for, any price and terms. If we do that, then they pay us a commission. That's it. That's how it works. That's the normal way you get paid. You put it on the market, they get an offer, they agree to that offer, everybody agrees to it, they sign it, they close escrow, I get paid. That's how it works. That's the main way that you get paid from the listing agreement. And probably 99% of the time, the only way a listing agent gets paid from the listing agreement. Okay. So keep that in mind quickly. There's another question here in the chat. How about this? Seller is okay with the listing at 650, but will only sell if the sales price is actually at least 675. Could that be included in the contract? You could, but if you're doing that, that's ridiculous. Like here's the thing. If I want 675, then put it at 675 and see what happens. Right? Because you're putting, as a listing agent, you're putting yourself in a position to be the reason why the seller is upset. If I agree to that, if I say to a seller, especially in the market we're in today, unless that 650 is considerably below market, which means the 675 should probably be below market also, maybe you could try that tactic. In this market, the idea right now is just price it at the right price and expect to sell it at that price. Right? As I'm doing the statistics and I'm going through and we look at what's happened over the course of this year as we get towards the end of the year, right? If you looked at January, February, March, and April, everybody was getting 103, 104, 105, 106% of their sales prices, right? Now it's so much considered that the average is, and this is for the entire year, is at 100 and like just about 102% of the sales price. Remember, that's averaging. What that would tell me is, oh, sorry, my microphone got. Tell me is that we're getting way below. We're probably right now, if you were to look at the last 2 or 3 months, we're probably getting 100 to 99% of our list price. So if the idea is that I'm going to list at 650 because I want 675, then that is not a good strategy. And if you approve that strategy when you're dealing with the seller, unless you have a business model behind it or some plan to try to get it sold, eventually that seller is going to blame you because they're going to say, you told me I could list 650 to get 675 when they get all their offers in at 650. So you could, yes, put it in the contract if that's what the seller wants. Would I do that? No. There isn't a disclosure for changing the listing price. That's what it's called. But the form right now is called, and I think in December it's changing, but it's modification of listing and buyer representation agreement. That's the total title of the form, because a buyer's representation agreement and a listing agreement are basically the same thing. It's modification of listing and buyer representation agreement. That's where you would change the price, the expiration date, any other terms, okay, after the fact. Okay, so let's move on. So that's the first one. You get paid because you sold it. That's the norm. That's what everybody expects. The second one, this is for exceptions. So if within blank calendar days, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. So basically what happens is this: your listing either expires or cancels, right? You get all the way through that 6-month listing period and you don't sell it. Or you guys come to an agreement on, yes, we're going to cancel the agreement because we just can't work together. What I always suggest you guys write in here is 180 days, which is roughly 6 months, right? It's not exactly 6 months, but it's roughly. So you're going to put 180 calendar days in there. What that means is this, is if from the expiration date or the cancel date, within that 180-day period after, if anybody who came in and saw the property, anybody that wrote an offer on the property, right? If I give you a list seller the day it expires or cancels of all of those people that wrote an offer or saw the property while I had a valid listing, if any of those people comes back to purchase the property within that 180-day period after the expiration or cancellation, I step back in as your listing agent to represent you in that transaction. That's what this section means right here. So that's the second way to get paid. Now, like I said, in order to do that, the day it expires or the day it cancels, I have to provide that seller with a list of every name of everybody that saw the property while I had it listed and every name of everybody that wrote an offer. The reason that this is hard to enforce is because I would guarantee that as listing agents, very rarely do you have any idea who saw your property unless you showed it. Right? You don't have a list of names. You don't know because we put a list, we put a lockbox. Agents go and show it. They don't tell you who your buyers are. So it's very difficult. This exception list is very difficult to enforce after the fact. What you should do, though, is at least those people who submitted offers, whether they were offers that were accepted or not, anybody that submitted an offer, give that name list to the sellers. Because really, those are probably the more likely to come back. If I submit an offer that got rejected, right? Maybe I come back because I think, okay, it expired. Price, maybe they're going to think about changing the price, right? I got another chance. So at least those lists. Yes, Jesus, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
What happens if someone submits an offer, let's say $20,000-$30,000 below asking price, and then expires, and then that offer or it sells for that person to that client for those $40,000-$50,000 below my price, but the listing is not longer anymore. It's not mine anymore. It's an expired now. Someone else picks it up and sell it with that person that we did not accept the offer prior 3 months. Do I still get paid?
Well, it wouldn't matter if they could do whatever they want if you didn't give them the list with that buyer's name on it. So if I didn't provide them when my listing expired, if I didn't give them a list of, 1 name, 10 names, 100 names, and that buyer, their name wasn't on the list and they came back and bought it, I would have nothing. If they came back and bought it, I would be able to say, hey, wait a minute, hold on. This person is buying it. That was a buyer that submitted and it's on the list. I have to step back in as listing agent. I don't care who the buyer's agent is. I step in as listing agent. That's what that means. The other thing with this exception list too is how are you guys going to know? I mean, to be completely 100% honest, unless the buyer was your buyer, how are you going to know that they sold it to somebody else? I mean, this is my suggestion. Like, I get it. Those exception lists, they're there. They exist. It's a way for you to protect your interests because you did the work. But if a listing expires and you're sitting there looking at, hey, it's an escrow now and who's they sell, like you've got to spend more time looking for new business. That's all. I mean, that would be my suggestion. But yes, you could protect yourself that way. Okay. Chat. Let's see. Some listings are requesting pre-qual letters in order to show. Now it makes sense why they want a pre-qual letter up front. Well, I mean, that started during COVID. The whole pre-qual letter being part of your request to show, that started during COVID. So if you guys can go back, if you can remember back to COVID real estate, where it was, one person in the property at a time, masks, had to have the PED form signed, right? All that stuff, all those other things. Like that's the thing is, we think about how we feel like, oh, this market sucks. This is terrible. Try to remember what it was like doing business during COVID, when it was hard to show and you had to do a PED and you had to wash your hands and you had to have booties and you couldn't do open houses and you couldn't really do showings and you're supposed to do it by video. I think we all forget really quickly how bad that time was when we start complaining about this one. But anyway, that idea of showing a pre-qual letter prior to, of providing a pre-qual letter prior to showing is a COVID, I think, holdover. But I don't necessarily think it's a horrible practice. It just, especially if you have like a house that's priced way below market, like, you're gonna have people like a lot of interest in it. Maybe you want to rule out people that are looky loos, but yeah, I mean, right now you want as many buyers to see that property as possible. So I don't know that, I don't know if that's really, if you want to be a gatekeeper for your listing that way. Oh, you're saying saving the pre-qual letters is a way of knowing who saw the property. Yeah, that could be, right. That could be a way for you to do that, sure, because you're not tracking any other way, but sure, you could do it that way. Um, again, like I said, this is one of those things like, yeah, you could go through the hassle of, I'm going to write down every name of every buyer that went through, but are you really going to keep track of the listing after you lose it? Right? Are you really going to do that? Maybe your energy should be spent on, what do I need to do to get the property sold? Right? Unless it's just an unreasonable seller and you really want to make sure that you're protecting yourself, go for it. But it is a difficult task. How would you become aware that a house is back for sale and one of the people on your list is interested? Again, that's what I said. Is like, there's a lot of, Sherlock Holmes going on, and they're trying to figure out who the buyer is and things like that. So it's difficult. It's not like a slam dunk, I'm going to get paid. They're selling to somebody that saw the property. Okay. The third way, and it's funny, we had practical application of this. We just had a conversation about an agent that's having an issue with a seller that the seller transferred title um, after they signed a listing, right? So they were the seller, they're on title, they're on the loan. They signed a listing agreement. Then they decided to transfer title to their niece, I believe, without getting our approval. Well, that's what this is saying right now. If without broker's prior written consent, the property is withdrawn from sale, conveyed, leased, rented, otherwise transferred, or made unmarketable by a voluntary act of seller during the listing period or any extension. So, for example, in that case, that seller transferred the title of the property to somebody completely different, right? So now we don't have an agreement to sell a property with that seller. That seller that originally signed the listing agreement technically owes us 100% of the commission because they transferred the property without our consent, making it unmarketable. So legally speaking, we have a right as a brokerage to that commission. And that's what that says in there. Now, it's not only that, it's unmarketable. So anybody ever have a listing where the seller now refuses to take care of the lawn, turns off the utilities, right? Has anybody heard of those stories? Has anybody had a buyer where they're trying to show a property and there's no electricity? The grass is overgrown. The house is starting to fall apart. That's making the property unmarketable because the seller is voluntarily not taking care of the property. That's unmarketable. I could conceivably go to that seller and say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I've asked you to turn on the utilities and to mow the lawn and to clean up in the front of the property, but you are voluntarily making it unmarketable. When can I pick up my commission check? Okay. Let's see. I got another here in chat. For some listings, some agents are requesting a full DU in order to write an offer considered. Is that enforceable? Anything that they're requesting technically is enforceable. I mean, they have their terms. Like, it's not illegal to say, look, we only want buyers that have a DU approval. There's nothing wrong with that. That's their terms. Their seller says, no, I don't want just a pre-qual letter that anybody could type up. I want to see that they're fully approved, that they've gone through the process and somebody's done it. So yeah, that is enforceable. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's nothing illegal about that. Okay, so that's 3 ways to get paid. And the fourth and final way, if completion of the sale is prevented by a party to the transaction other than the seller, well, the only other party is the buyer, right? Then compensation which otherwise would have been earned under paragraph 3A shall be payable only if and when seller collects damages by suit, arbitration, settlement, or otherwise. And then in an amount equal to the lesser of 1/2 of the damages recovered or the above compensation after first deducting title and escrow expenses and the expenses of collection, if any. So what that's saying is this: if the buyer defaults, right, they're in breach of contract, and the seller is able to retain the buyer's deposit, technically they owe us 50% of that deposit or our entire commission, whichever is least, right? Yeah. So 50% or a commission, right? So if there was $100,000 deposit in there, right? So half of that they got, or they got the whole thing, and half of that was 50,000. I don't get the whole 50,000. I would be entitled to my commission. Now, here's the thing: even though that's in there, you're probably never going to collect that or enforce that. Because here's the thing: if I get you into escrow, Mr. Seller, and then the buyer does something wrong and you are able, and we all know it's not 100%, it's not an easy task to get the deposit, right? But you're able to retain the deposit to cover damages because that buyer was in breach. I'm not going to come knock on your door and say, okay, give me my piece, especially if I want to continue to work with you. Right? If I still have a valid listing agreement and we can put it back into escrow and we can sell it, why am I going to now try to take away some of the benefit of what you received as payment for them breaching the contract? I'm probably not going to do that. The only time I'm probably going to put that into effect is if now somehow you're deciding that you want to cancel the listing because the deal canceled and it's not a valid reason to cancel. Maybe then I use that as, leverage, or to try to grease the wheels to keep us working together, or to push you towards the idea of continuing to market. But really, collecting is probably not going to be something that's super likely. Okay. So that's as far as we're going to get today. We'll finish the listing agreement next Thursday. But those are the 4 ways that this agreement allows compensation to be paid to the brokerage, to the listing brokerage, and ultimately to you. Okay. Questions? Any questions? No questions on anything? All right. So we will, like I said, we'll finish that next Thursday. We'll finish this agreement for sure. It's not going to take more than another class. We'll probably be done relatively quickly. And if you guys don't have any other questions, I'll let you go. Enjoy the rest of your day. Be productive. And I'll talk to you guys soon.
Thank you, Kyle.